Hi, I'm Jim Bitterle, and I'll be presenting today. I have spent 30 years in the manufacturing world. I started my career as a supervisor on the shop floor, had great opportunities to work my way up to the vice president of manufacturing, and then ran a number of manufacturing businesses up to $300 million in revenue. When our company was sold, I decided to go into consulting, and for the last 15 years, I've worked with manufacturing companies of all types and sizes, doing turnaround, operational improvement, and strategy work with these companies. So it's my honor to be with you today to talk about these issues that are common among manufacturing companies, and in particular in managing the talent that you have. Today we'll talk specifically about some of the state of affairs in manufacturing and what are some of the key issues driving the talent wars, as we call them, that are going on. We'll also talk about attracting talent and, most importantly, retaining that talent once you've got it on board. And then we'll give you a few specific recommendations about how you can take some of this information and apply it to your environment. I always tell people that when you ever get any sort of educational or training information thrown at you, pick one or two or three of the key things and try to implement that. Always walk away at least with one takeaway, and hopefully you're going to find more than one of those in today's topics. So if you think about manufacturing today and you think about what's going on with the labor force that we have and the manufacturing talent that we have what we consider a talent war going on among manufacturing companies. And there are many reasons for this, but one of the critical things that we see today is that 2.5% of all manufacturing jobs are vacant. And that's not such a radical number today, but the difficulty is that the duration of these vacancies tends to be very long, and it tends to be with many of the more technical jobs and the more skilled jobs that we're seeing the vacancies. When we go back to the Great Recession and we look at turnover within manufacturing environments, we saw the numbers were quite high, and it was voluntary and involuntary in terms of the types of turnover that existed. But since the Great Recession ended, we've seen, as you'll see in the chart, we've seen the turnover levels go down, and the overall turnover levels have generally been going down since 2008. But what we're seeing is a rebound in the involuntary turnover levels. In fact, they're up over 10.4, and some of the most recent data that we've seen now coming in for 2014, which is not conclusive data, is that those numbers are well over 11%. So we're really seeing involuntary turnover levels beginning to spike. So what we want to do is really look at turnover company to company and try to better understand what's going on. I'm using some example data here that you can see on this chart from the metal forming industry. They are really indicative and symbolic of many of the other industries in manufacturing in terms of what's happening relative to turnover. If you look at the industry average in metal forming turnover levels, you can see that the rates are somewhere around 19%. But when you look at the best-in-class companies in metal forming, you'll see that those rates are somewhere around 4%. Those differences are pretty common among the different segments of manufacturing businesses. So we're using metal forming purely as an example in this particular case. Sticking with metal forming as an example, we decided to say, what can we see in terms of turnover and profitability of those companies? Is there any correlation between the two? There clearly is, especially during normal times. Now, what we saw was during the Great Recession, we saw that turnover levels were pretty high among the most profitable as well as the least profitable companies. And I think what was happening is as we would expect, good companies, bad companies alike were jettisoning employees to right-size their business based on revenue streams. But during more normalized times, 2007, 2010 in our data, 2011, what we see is that the companies that are more profitable generally have significantly lower levels of turnover than those companies that are not as profitable. And we do believe that there is a relationship and a correlation between those two factors. A lot of people just think about the basic costs that are obvious when they think about turnover. We think about advertising for open positions, recruiting, interviewing, onboarding, training, and then those employees, once they're on board, have to go up a learning curve. But what's not obvious are all those hidden costs associated with turnover. What we typically see is overtime levels tend to spike because certain people, when they leave, everybody else has to make up the workload. That results in overtime. We see stress-related issues. We see quality-related issues, on-time delivery, customer satisfaction, and significant financial issues as it relates to turnover. I recently worked with a company. We were doing a turnaround. It's a large manufacturing company that had a very, very high level of turnover, close to 30%. And in their situation, what we saw was they were having significant quality issues. They were having significant on-time delivery issues. And ultimately what this resulted in for this particular company is they lost their #1 customer, and it related to on-time delivery performance and quality. When we looked for root causes for these, it almost always tracked directly back to new employees and the turnover that was going on in their organization. Usually we had new employees doing jobs that they were not properly trained for, making mistakes, and not getting the production out on a timely basis. So in their particular situation, turnover actually took a company that was profitable and stable and converted them to one of my clients that was a turnaround client that required intervention from professional turnaround managers. Attracting talent is the beginning of the cycle. It's very difficult to attract talent today, as many of you know. And there's many reasons for that. There's no one single reason, but I want to talk about a few of them. First of all, when you think big picture and you look at our economy and you look at employment by sector, if you go back to 1950, as the chart shows you, 30% of all jobs were in the manufacturing sector. Today, we're down close to 10%. So what's happening is we're seeing that those jobs, the number of jobs, are slowly shrinking. So there really hasn't been a great demand for manufacturing personnel. And parents, school counselors, all the influencers of America's younger either students or workers are telling them to stay away from manufacturing because there really is no future there. And in fact, there are some individuals that think manufacturing is dead and that it's not part of the long-term economy in America, which couldn't be more far from the truth. So if we think about that, we have fewer younger people that want to go into the workforce. On the top end of the scale, we have the older workers. And if you really look at the trends, the baby boomers are aging out and they're beginning to retire in droves. In fact, during the first decade of the new millennium, the workers between the ages of 55 and 64 increased by 52%. And those numbers are growing, and it's largely due to baby boomers who tend to have lots of manufacturing experience and skills that are very, very difficult to replace. These people are aging out. So you as a company are caught in the middle. It's hard to get young workers to come into manufacturing with the core skills and behaviors that you want. At the same time, you're losing your older workers that have many of the skills and attributes that you're looking for. When it comes to attracting talent, look, there is no silver bullet, but there's many different things that you can do. With the younger workers, flexibility in the job environment is critical. That's hard to do in many manufacturing environments, yet we are seeing really creative ways to bring flexibility into the jobs. And some of it's related to cross-training, making sure that your employees have the ability to provide services or jobs or fulfill multiple different jobs. And then within the cross-training environment, you can put them into jobs that have greater flexibility from time to time. Referral systems. It used to be entirely common that companies would have referral bonuses for people that would attract good workers to their company. Many companies have abandoned those. It's time to bring them back. Non-traditional populations, ex-offenders, veterans, non-custodial parents. There's all kinds of populations that we often ignore that can be a great source of manufacturing labor and talent. Veterans, young veterans in America have the highest unemployment rate of any other segment of our population. They have discipline, they show up to work on time, and they're not 18 years old. They tend to be a little bit older and they've matured. This is a great source of labor, and they have transferable skills that oftentimes will work nicely in your environment. Internships. Internships used to be very common. Today, many internships are very low quality internships or non-existent. We recommend that you put together high quality internships with meaningful jobs. You don't want to give your intern a job that is meaningless and tedious, that has no value, because that's not a great way to try to recruit that person into your company, nor is it a great way to motivate them to go into a manufacturing type of environment. Internships can be very positive. Career ladders. Make sure that your new employees understand what is the progression of jobs that they could go through so that they can grow and develop in your company. Too often we hire people without ever giving them that understanding of what their career could look like within your company. Compensation and benefits. The client that I mentioned earlier was paying their starting workers $8 an hour for tedious, hard assembly jobs. When we really think about that, the average kid that's 19 years old can go get a job in a bar or a restaurant making $12 or $13 an hour, where much of the money is under the table. So, and they have greater flexibility in those environments. So you really have to look at your compensation structure. If you're paying at the minimum level, you're going to get the lowest workers and the lowest form of labor that you can possibly get that aren't going to be dependable, where you are going to have quality issues, where you are going to have other issues. We always say if you don't pay now, you will pay later, and it may not, and it may be more costly, and it may be in forms that aren't as obvious. Developing your own talent pipeline. High schools, trade schools, community colleges. Build relationships with the schools. Build relationships. Go in and actively recruit at those schools. Many people don't do that. Market your company and your culture. Look at your website. Does it really promote your culture? Have you got core values that everybody in your employment understands what they are? Have they been trained on them? And have you made it part of life at your company? And have you created a culture that people feel good about? Do that and use that as part of your marketing tool. Hiring criterion, website upgrades, benchmarking against other companies. There's many different ideas. But there are lots of things. As I said before, there's no silver bullet, but there are many different things you can do to improve your ability to attract talent. Now let's talk about retaining talent. I've got 10 different items that we can talk about that will help in terms of your job retention. The first one is the relationship with the boss. There is data that is fairly robust that supports that the number one reason people leave jobs is because of the relationship that they have with their boss. So it's important to do exit interviews when people leave to try to identify, do you have certain supervisors or managers that are habitually difficult to work for, that create turnover issues for you. Make turnover on a total company and an individual manager or supervisor basis one of their KPIs and measure it. And those that need help, get them training. And frankly, if turnover continues to be high and they're very difficult bosses to work for, then you really need to think about, do you have that person in the right role in your company? Workload and work-life balance issues are huge. It's becoming even bigger for two populations. Younger people, especially the millennials, they really desire work-life balance. They want to have meaning in their job. So it's very important that you understand that. With the older workers that are getting close to retirement or thinking about retirement, one of the great ways to retain them is to create more flexible schedules, maybe even reduced work hours, etc., and let them balance their need to find more leisure time as they're aging in their lives. Something that is a very common issue with many of the clients that we have is we see high levels of turnover, and what happens is large amounts of work and burden get shifted over to the remaining workers. And oftentimes many things get shifted to the good workers. And oftentimes we find burnout with some of the better workers in the company, which leads to more turnover. And you certainly don't want to have turnover with your better employees. So pay close attention to those workload and work-life balance issues. We're starting to see companies actually institute boundaries for work hours. You know, you can't work more than X number of hours a week. We don't want you to be doing emails, for example, after a certain time in the day. Just certain things so that we can create a culture of a balanced work and work-life environment. The organization's financial stability has a huge impact on turnover. Employees are not stupid. They know and they can sense when a company is not doing well financially. Raises get cut or eliminated. They see work conditions degrade. They see and feel the slowness in your plant. They understand when things aren't going well and they sense it. They sense the pressure. What happens is they get nervous. They worry about paychecks, they worry about their own job security, they worry about their future. And the worst thing that happens is it's your best employees that are the most marketable, and they're the first ones that can find jobs elsewhere. So if you are struggling financially, get a turnaround expert in your facility, create a growth and diversification plan, create a turnaround plan, and get your company back on track. There's no shame with the average business owner or key manager. Most of them don't have experience turning around troubled companies. Bring in a professional. You know, you're not going to cure yourself of cancer. You're going to get a doctor to do that. So if you have an issue, get a turnaround professional to help you. Financial and job content opportunities. Amazingly enough, a lot of people feel that their jobs are dead ends, whether it be from an opportunity or a financial perspective. And many times they're not dead-end jobs. So it's important that you communicate to your employees what are those opportunities financially and from a job content standpoint. We see time and time again many good younger workers leave because their perception is the job is dead end, when in fact there were career ladders that existed that should have been communicated, and there were job opportunities, there were pay increase opportunities for that individual to grow with the company, but it was never clearly communicated to that individual, so they looked for greener pastures. The relationships that your workers have with one another has a tremendous impact on morale, and it can directly influence turnover levels. Whenever you see poisonous environments where there's lots of poor relationships, it accelerates departures. We see a very strong correlation between poor cultures and higher turnover. And oftentimes there's a few individuals that are really sort of driving some of those negative cultural aspects. Identify who those people are, give them counseling, and if, frankly, they can't modify their behaviors, then you really need to move them out of your organization. Lack of engagement or challenge is the sixth item that we see creating turnover. And what you really want to look for is who are your good employees, and make sure they're challenged, make sure they're engaged. We're seeing more and more companies do engagement surveys where they ask about the culture, how happy are you in your job, are you engaged in what you're doing, etc. And then get feedback from your employees about what can we do differently to make your job more engaging, to make it more interesting, to make it more challenging. There's a lot of good information and insight that can come from your workforce. We talk about micromanagement as a problem for many, many different reasons. Nobody that we've ever talked to likes to be micromanaged. So lack of autonomy that's created by that, lack of independence that's created by that, is something that ultimately takes workers, and you take their brain, which is the most valuable thing they have, and you limit their ability to use that brain, to make decisions, to grow, to think about their job. Because really they're just becoming a machine if you're micromanaging them. You're telling them what to do, when, where, and how, and you've removed the thought process. So you have to find ways to remove micromanagement out of your organization. Figure out who your micromanagers are and train them not to be micromanagers. Train them to empower. People can learn and they can change their management behaviors. But certainly there are some chronic micromanagers that exist that aren't going to change, and in those situations you need to find non-management roles for those types of folks. The meaningfulness of work, or the contribution to the organization, is something that's critical, especially for younger employees. The millennials, more than any other generation we've seen, need to have a clear path to understand of how their job is helping the company and how it's helping society in general. We were working with a fastener company, and they had high turnover levels. And many of the young people that we talked to didn't really see any meaningfulness in their work. They didn't understand that the screws and bolts that they were making, when they made a product that was high quality, how it helped the company, and in some cases, those bolts were actually going into seat belts in cars, which they did not know. So can you imagine if you have a child strapped in with a safety belt and you've got their car seat in there and the bolt holding the seat latch breaks? You know, it could cause death. Those types of things were never actually communicated to the employees. They did not even know what the end uses of their fasteners were. They also didn't understand that when they made some quality products, or they let some poor quality items go through, that it risked not only losing customers, but it also risked pay raises to each of the employees. It risked the reputation of the company. It risked the financial stability of the company. Those are all things that need to be communicated. They may seem obvious to us as owners or managers. It's not always obvious to some of your younger and newer workers. It's important that they understand the bigger picture. Corporate culture and environment. If we think about it, it was something that just kind of evolves naturally in most of our businesses. But in today's world, the companies that are succeeding and are winning at the talent war are very deliberate about building the type of culture they want and supporting the type of culture and hiring for culture that they want. So you really need to define your culture and the environment that you want, and have some KPIs. Have a dashboard and have 1 or 2 KPIs on that dashboard that measure culture. Also make sure that you're training for culture, that everybody understands what your core competencies are, what your core values are, etc. And hire for that. Make sure that folks coming in are going to be a fit for your culture. Lastly, performance management, performance recognition. It is simply astounding how often we find that employees are not given true appraisals. They're not given feedback to improve their performance. And then they're not given feedback on when they're doing a great job. And the great workers are not really aware of the fact that they're doing a phenomenal job. When you have good workers doing an exceptional job, they need to know it, and you need to enforce their behaviors, and they need to know it, because too often we find workers that are either A, doing a poor job and they don't know it, and they probably don't want to be doing a poor job. In fact, 9 times out of 10 we recognize they think they're doing a good job, but nobody's ever told them that they're not. And the good workers oftentimes don't understand where they're at either. And those are the folks that you want to make sure you hold on to and keep for the long haul. Many other suggestions. If you look at your screen, there are a few here for you. I'll just touch on a couple. One, measure your turnover. Measure it, track it, and if you have to, measure it by manager, because there may be 1 or 2 managers that are driving higher levels of turnover. That can be addressed. Provide regular performance reviews. People need to know how they're doing, and they need to know where they need to focus their efforts to improve, and what strengths they have that can be built upon. Make sure that you use exit interviews. When people leave, you have a great opportunity to get generally objective information about your own company. What's good about your company, what's bad about your company, what are the areas, the opportunities for improvement. Exit interviews can be exceptionally valuable to continually improving your own company. So, let's talk about implementation. Anytime there's training or knowledge that's conveyed, it's important that you absorb it and that you use it, right? This is all worth nothing unless you implement some of the changes that we've talked about. Maybe not everything, but if you can pick 2 or 3 things that are important, let's find those and let's implement them. A starting point would be with your HR manager. Make sure that they are not just a tactical person in your organization, but make sure that they are strategic. To do that, a couple of things have to happen. Create some metrics for that person and measure them on that. But also raise their profile in your company. In my last company, we had a VP of HR that reported to a CFO. Ultimately, we changed his title to CPO, Chief Personnel Officer. We then changed his reporting relationship directly to our CEO, and we had him attend our board meetings. We raised the profile of him and brought him into more of the strategic discussions. Today, the talent war requires you to be very strategic about your management, your talent management, and how you manage your whole HR function. Those that are ahead of the game and that treat HR as a strategic function will win. They're going to be way ahead of those that don't. So, the second thing is pick 2 or 3 of the most important recommendations that I've talked about and let's implement them. Let's make sure that you raise them to a level of awareness that they're going to get attention, create a plan to implement them, and then follow up on that plan to make sure they get implemented. And then make sure, again, that in your dashboards or your dashboard that you've got some KPIs that measure some of those critical elements for HR and how you're performing from a talent management standpoint. 2 words of wisdom for you. The first one, keep churn low. Keep your turnover low. It's going to hurt your morale, and it's going to cost you far more than you can possibly imagine. We see it time and time again, and we see high-performing, highly profitable companies with low turnover, and we see many underperforming, sometimes companies that are losing money with very high levels of turnover. There's a clear correlation between the two, and frankly, turnover costs you probably 10 times what the obvious costs of just recruiting, hiring, and training are. The last word of wisdom for you is attraction and retention of talent is critical to the long-term success of your business. Make it a top priority. It's the talent war is not going to get better, it's going to get worse, and those that get ahead of the game are going to win. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, my contact details are on the screen. We're happy to answer any questions that you may have about this particular video. Thank you and good luck.